So thank you very much to the RSB for inviting us to participate in today's conference. We'll be speaking about the digital transformation of outreach and engagement activities. So the Francis Crick Institute is the largest biomedical research under one roof in all of Europe. We are based at King's Cross here in London, and we're a partnership between the Medical Research Council, Cancer Research UK, Wellcome, UCL King's, and Imperial. We believe in discovery without boundaries, and we champion so many of the values that we're discussing at today's conference. One of our strategic priorities is the engagement and the inspiration is engaging and inspiring the public. We believe that science is for everyone and that it's important for everyone to be able to take part and to be involved. In this spirit, when I was invited to partake in today's conference, I, of course, decided to collaborate. I am hugely privileged to be part of the Crick's public engagement team. And so today, many of us will be speaking to you about the various activities that we've been involved with in order to share science more widely with the public. First, we're going to hear about a primary virtual event from Christina and Berta. Then Andy will be speaking about a secondary year group activity. Then my colleague Richard from Regent High School and I will be speaking about a borough-wide science challenge. And finally, our will be talking about Meet a Scientist, which engages audiences beyond London. So I'd like to now hand over to Christina and Berta.
Thank you, Maria. So I'm Christina. I'm one of the science education officers within the Crick's education outreach team. So I joined this role 14 months ago, and my background is in secondary biology teaching. Berta?
Hello everyone, I'm Berta and I'm a postdoc fellow at the Crick where I study how the human brain develops. And apart from being a scientist, I'm also very passionate about science education and public engagement. And I will just take any opportunity to step outside the lab and talk about science.
Maria, if we can have the next slide, please. So just to set a little bit of context for you, the Crick's education outreach programme takes place within our home borough of Camden. And the overall aim of our programme is to grow and diversify the community of young people that are studying and aspiring to work in science. And one of the ways that we do this is by delivering workshops to our local primary schools. Most of these workshops are delivered by us going into schools. And we also invite Year 5 students here to the Crick for a day of science. And you can see examples of both of those in the left-hand images. So we've got us in school in the top image, and then students in our dedicated teaching lab in the bottom image. Now, of course, in March 2020, with the onset of the pandemic and the closure of the schools, our programme had to pause. However, we were able to restart it as soon as October 2020, and we were able to go back into schools after adapting our workshops to make sure that they were COVID secure. However, we did find that some of our schools were unable to have visitors on site, and this was due to their COVID risk assessments at the time. And so a couple of those schools approached us asking if we could do anything virtually instead. This included Gospel Oak Primary School. Now, we've got a particularly good relationship with this school, and that's because their science lead, Claire, is very engaged and very proactive. And at the same time, Berta approached the education team looking for a new project to get involved in. So myself, Berta and Claire from Gospel Oak decided to use this opportunity to collaborate and to develop a new virtual offering for a Year 6 audience, because that's the year group that Claire teaches. So this was the beginning of our development process. We started with the question, if we can't get into school to deliver our workshops in person, what can we do instead? What can we deliver virtually? Now, we didn't want to turn our normal workshops into something virtual. That was because we were aware that later on in the academic year, COVID risk assessments might change and we might be able to get into schools. And also we had the opportunity to try something new, so we wanted to do that. So instead we looked to another Crick event for inspiration, and that was Meet a Scientist on Instagram. Now, Lauren is going to talk more about this in detail later on, but in brief, it involves the scientists filming an introductory video about themselves and their research. This is put onto Instagram and followers are invited to submit questions. The scientist then comes back online later on in the week answers those questions. So that was the starting point for our activity. However, we wanted the event to be a live one rather than a recorded one. And we also wanted there to be a practical element for the children. So I'm now going to hand over to Berta for the next slide, who's going to explain more about the event.
So our particular activity was an online event for Year 6 pupils. And as Christina said, we work with the Gospel Oak Primary School. And we ran the event in 2 classes in parallel, and we used Zoom as the platform for video calling. So the overall event was organized in 2 separated sessions. The first one ran with the 2 classes in parallel, and it included a 15-minute presentation where I introduced myself, the scientist, and also my research around the brain. And as Christina said, we followed a similar format than the intro video of the Meta Scientist Instagram stories. At the end of the session, where we did set them a challenge that was related to my research so that they could perform some hands-on experiments on their own. So they took the challenge during lesson time, and that was guided by their teachers. So before the challenge, we sent the schools all the required materials, and that included comprehensive guidance for the teacher to facilitate the challenge, as well as worksheets for the pupils to record their results, and bits and pieces of equipment that were necessary for the challenge. So 1 week after the first event, we met them again via Zoom. And this time we run the sessions individually for each class because they involve direct interactions between the pupils and us, pupils. So this second session was about 40 minutes long. And in the first part, the pupils had the chance to report their findings back to us. So they shared with us the results, as well as some ideas of what they would like to investigate next from the results they find in the challenge. We gave them feedback, and we also highlighted all the efforts that they did by working scientifically as a class. And next, in that session, we hosted a Q&A session with a scientist, and again, inspired by the Meta Scientist Instagram stories. And this was a good opportunity for the pupils to ask questions to the scientists related about what is it to be a scientist, what's your work like, why did you become a scientist, and how. And so it was a chance for me to inspire some of them by sharing my experiences as a scientist. So Maria, if I can have the next slide, please. Yes, perfect. So overall, the event went really well. And because it was a live event, it was much more interactive and engaging than it was if it was pre-recorded. So one of the key elements was to ensure that the event ran smoothly on the day. So for that, we contacted the IT team at Crick to check that all the equipment was set up correctly in the room. We also made sure that they were on hand during the video call in case we had any technical issues during the video calls, and also to improve the quality of the audio from the class, because we were a bit concerned of the sound. We gave them external microphones to use during the second session when the pupils were talking to us directly. Including a practical challenge was also a very important part of the event, although we were not directly involved in it. And we chose a challenge that was easy for the teacher to run, easy for the children to report, and that was also related to the Year 6 curriculum. As I mentioned, we shared with the teachers a very clear and detailed guidance of how to run the challenge, and that includes sections on resources, on setting up the challenge, carrying out the experiments. It also includes some risks assessments and safety, some prompts to guide the discussion of the results. And because the pupils were reporting their results to us, they had a chance to participate directly, and that made the session more exciting and engaging for them. The Q&A session was also a very popular section of the event because it was another opportunity for the pupils to directly ask questions to a scientist. And in order to prepare the answers from all the questions, because they had a lot of questions, we asked the teachers to share them with us a few days in advance so I could prepare the answers properly. And just to finish up with this question, with this section, I wanted to share with you one of my favorite piece of feedback that we got from the school evaluation, which is summarized here, and it says many pupils were able to relate to Berta, myself, and becoming a scientist seems more like a realistic career option after taking part of the challenge. And so with this nice quote, I will now hand over to Christina, who will share a bit about what we've learned and what's next.
Thank you, Berta. Yes, so we delivered this event back in April of this year. And since then, actually, we've been really fortunate that our in-person primary programme is now almost back to where it was pre-pandemic. So nearly, if not all of our schools are welcoming visitors again. And we're also able to host Year 5s here in the Crick. So that's really fantastic news for us. But it does actually mean that we don't currently have a need for this particular event that Berta and I have developed. However, we have learned lots from it, and it is likely to be a model we'll use again in the future, you know, whether that's because we find ourselves in a situation where we might need it once more, or perhaps we might use it to create a new offering for our primary or perhaps our secondary audiences. So we think the model was a great way to allow scientists to engage with school children, particularly for scientists that don't have the time to go into schools in person. However, as I mentioned earlier, our outreach programme involves reaching all state schools in Camden, and there are almost 45 primary schools in Camden. So if we were going to use this model, we would need to look at scaling it up. And there's a number of things that we would need to do in order to achieve that scalability. So firstly, we'd need to have some sort of off-the-shelf offering for the challenge. So in this instance, Berta and I worked together with Claire from Gospel Oak to develop the challenge. We had the time to do that. We also had Claire's flexibility and enthusiasm to try something new. However, it just wouldn't be feasible to do that every time we had a new scientist come on board for this event. Instead, we'd need to have something that's sort of ready to go, or perhaps we could have a small selection of challenges that the scientist or maybe the teacher choose from. We'd also need to think about how we coordinate the availability of our researchers with that of the schools, and whether that's something that we facilitate or we put them in touch to do. Our version of the event, as Berta explained, involved 2 video calls, the introductory one and the feedback one. So we had to timetable both of those. So perhaps we could look at the scientists pre-recording their introductory video, and then it would only be a case of timetabling that second video, and that might make it a bit easier to do. Our version of the event also involved a member of the education team. That was me. I was there to help facilitate the calls, to be on board for any technology issues, and also to observe and take part, given that it was a pilot that I had helped develop. However, to scale this up, we would want the scientists to be doing these video calls by themselves. We think that that's actually something that would be fairly straightforward to achieve. We would just, of course, make sure that the education team are there to provide the necessary support via training and resources. And then to keep the pilot small and manageable, we offered it only to Year 6, which was Claire's year group. If we do scale this event up, we would still consider limiting it to just 1 year group, especially given the number of schools in our borough. And given that the Q&A session allowed students to learn more about becoming a scientist, we actually think that Year 6 is a really good year group to target. And then finally, there are a number of existing models that do provide interactions with scientists. And I've given a few examples of these on the slide now, so things like Skype a Scientist. So we'd maybe look to these and see what we could learn from them. These are all really fantastic schemes. They've all got their own sort of pros and cons, but they do all allow scalability, so definitely something to learn from those. So in summary, our event was a very successful pilot. But if we do scale it up in the future, we'd need to give a little bit more thought to the format and how exactly we go about doing that. So thank you very much for listening, and we're now going to hand over to Andy.
Thanks. I'm hoping people can hear me okay. So I'm Andy. I used to be a scientific researcher, so rather like the researchers here at the Crick, but I moved out of that, did my teaching qualification, did my PGCE, and I was a secondary school science teacher at a non-selective state school for 5 years. And then I joined the Crick, where I'm now combining both my scientific background and my understanding of pedagogy in schools in order to do outreach here. I'm going to talk about an outreach in our local secondary schools, so moving from primary to secondary, and how the approach for this has changed due to going to virtual, and that was precipitated by the fact of the pandemic. So if I could have the next slide. So our secondary schools often come to us with requests in order to enrich their teaching, but also they also want to enrich their work-related learning or careers input that they have for their students. So we had this brief that was given to us. It was a STEAM drop-down day from one of our local schools for both Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. They wanted us to provide something for their year 9 and 10 specifically, and a class, so for up to 30 students, and it would be a 1-hour session where we would go into the school. We would then do this session on multiple occasions and do it 2 or 3 or 4 times in the day that we visited. So that's what the school wanted. Obviously, we have our own strategy here at the Francis Crick Institute and what we want to achieve with our outreach. And there are many different things that there are many activities that we would like to do and strategies that we would like to hit. But the ones that we chose for this particular activity, engaging students with those roles linked to the Crick. So in that case, we want to try and get them trying to hit those careers messages. We want to highlight transferable skills. And also, as it is a STEAM day, not a STEM day, we were wanting to illustrate the creativity in the cover. So what do we... Next slide, please, Maria. Thank you. So I won't actually go into the details of this too much because this is what we did pre-pandemic, but our approach was to, we developed an activity based around viral gene therapy, which reflects some of the work that we do here at the Crick. And I worked with 2 different researchers in the area to come up with a hands-on activity that students did that extended and enriched the curriculum that they already knew about viruses. They were given differentiated worksheets. We were there in person to lead them through the idea of viral gene therapy, and then they had to use the information in order to physically make a model of a virus. They had big polystyrene balls. They could choose which size depending on which disease they were trying to treat, how big the genes were, what surface antigens they needed in order to target it to particular cell types, and then they had to think about how they would deliver that to the patients involved. So, as I said, the actual thing is not particularly important, but the approach is, and that was that we wanted face-to-face engagement with Crick scientists in order to explain those STEM roles related to the Crick. It was based on genuine science. It was worked up with the scientists themselves. There was a choice. It was differentiated. There was teamwork. And importantly, it was really important that we had the scientists there in order to help them with the physical modelling of it and to answer any questions that they had. So that was the activity. It worked pretty well. We were happy with it, a few tweaks, and we could happily use it again, which is entirely what we were expecting to do. And that is until, of course, next slide, please, the pandemic. So we did get the school come back to us a year later, wanting us to run an activity. But as you can see, the goalposts had changed. This time, just because of the school itself, they changed it to a year 7 class instead of year 9 and 10. So therefore the topic wasn't particularly suitable for that age of students. They had more time to be able to do it, simply because now students are either doing this from home or from school, depending on where they were, if they were shielding or not. And so we actually had 2 hours to fill instead of 1 hour, which actually turned out to be an advantage. But the most important thing was that now it had to be virtual, either live or we could pre-record the session that they could show to the students. So, not unsurprisingly, as you can see from our approach previously, if we go to the next slide, none of that was really appropriate. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. No, if you could go back one, sorry, Maria, my mistake. So yes, all of those approaches were really not appropriate, simply because, mainly because there weren't any of us there to physically support the students with their questions and with any of the more technical sides of the information that we were trying to give them. So what did we do? Well, if we go to the next slide, what we decided to do was just take a step back and have a look at what we wanted to do with this new brief. Our aims remain the same. We still want to engage the students with STEM roles and transferable skills and creativity, but how we go about that is obviously going to have to change. So in those speech bubbles, those are the sorts of things that we would want to do anyway, regardless. But now with the new brief, we had some new problems in order to overcome. So if we can have the next slide. I appreciate there are lots of writing here, but this is for you to understand just the sorts of things that we took into consideration. Some of these are as a result of the pandemic, and some of these are a result of going virtual. So now we had to fill 2 hours because of students weren't allowed to move around the school, or they might be at home and they wanted them to be able to have a good meaty thing to do. Delivered by Zoom, obviously, that's going to be very much more of a challenge. Had to be suitable to do at home or in school. And now this really did have a knock-on effect that whatever they did, they weren't going to have us there to support them. So whatever topic they didn't need any specialist knowledge from the student or any adults who might be supporting them. And also it had to be a format where actually adult support wasn't essential at all, because if they were at home, they may not have an adult there who was available to support them with this particular activity. So all of these things had to be taken into consideration. Also, because we couldn't go into the school now, interaction with Crick staff for our own aims was also going to become a little bit more of a challenge. And also, just from a logistical point of view, if they're going to be doing something physically in school with other students or at home, then those resources that they need have to be available to them without us having to being able to supply them as we did before. And if they are in school, because of coronavirus, they have to be shared among students. So we had quite a lot of things to consider. So what did we do to change this in light of the coronavirus and going virtual? So next slide, please. So what topics did we choose? Well, we chose science communication. One, because we know a lot about it here at the Crick, because we've got a public engagement team and a science communication team. So that was one reason. But also we felt that the students would know about this topic already. They're familiar with it. They come across it every day, either by doing Google searches, watching TV, their own social media. They will know about how science is communicated to them. So we thought this was quite a good one. So what we did was we did this all over Zoom, live, run by myself and my colleague in the education team, Ellie. We set the challenge up and the students had the opportunity to ask us questions either about the challenge or about ourselves. So how do we go about doing this so that it could be fulfilling our aims and the student brief? So if I could have the next slide. We set them the challenge to, as it shows there, clearly communicate a topic in STEM in a way that Year 7 students would enjoy, in other words, their own peer group. And we gave them loads and loads of different ideas from examples that we've used here at the Crick from our public engagement activities. We had in mind, of course, that the students need to be able to access these if they wanted to choose one of these to do them themselves. So we had a poster, straightforward one. Or if there was a particular scientific investigation, they could make some clear instructions on how to do that. And one that we've got there is a sort of lava lamp type of idea, which you've probably seen before. Or we've got news reports. They'll be very familiar with these from watching TV. They could draw a comic strip about any aspect of science that they wanted to do as well. So all of these are pretty easy for them to be able to access and do themselves. But unfortunately, if we're looking at our aims, engaging students with STEM roles or STEAM roles, then the students have just met myself and my colleague. So how could we enrich that? So if I could have the next slide. We also incorporated some ideas using the more in-person stuff that has gone digital on our website already. So we had Jan, who some of you may recognise her from the Great British Bake Off X number of years ago. Well, she's one of our scientists. And so she did a video of making a model of a cell using sweets and cupcakes, which was great. So that's the sort of thing that a student can do as well. Myself and Faye there, we hosted an online quiz for students to do all about science, or they could just do a piece to camera about the science that they like. So these were all of the ideas that we got the students to consider. How do we then go about the topic, bearing in mind that the topic we wouldn't be there to support them with? So next slide, please. So we went for a topic that they already knew about. So we went to the school teachers first and said, what have they already covered, whether it be in science or maths, engineering, any of the other topics. So those are the sorts of topics that they suggested, which meant that we had no problem in them being able to access information for them to be able to put some science communication activity together. And that certainly bypassed that. So did it work? That's the question. If I could have the next slide. We've got some examples there on the left of some of the students' work that they came up with. One student did come up and do a video of a little science practical, basically the vinegar and sodium bicarbonate. We had posters, we had quizzes. And I think it was a real success in this particular point because we did manage to hit most of those points that are in the blue bubbles that we were trying to hit. It is delivered via Zoom. It was a 2-hour activity because the students could continue with it once we'd finished. They had some interaction with Crick staff. All of those things we did manage to achieve. But did it really work from our point of view? Was it really hitting our aims and was it really hitting the brief? So if I could have the next slide. What you can see there is, yes, it did hit some things, but not others. So there was a much greater choice of format and topic, because students could choose what the heck they wanted to do instead of us telling them, you must make this model of a virus. Greater opportunity to express their own ideas, which is lovely, rather than it being a little bit more directed. But really, really good was the ability to better engage the whole year group. Because this was virtual, it meant that we could reach a period of time, and also how much depth can you go into in an assembly. Our class practical is great, but unfortunately with the in-class practical is they need us there in order to be able to support that. So in this way, we managed to get around that as well. The downsides, as you see in the bottom right there, was they needed a computer. It was all done virtually, so without it, they couldn't actually access it. The interaction with Crick staff virtually, never as good as in person. We had to choose a topic that they'd already done, so we couldn't go in there and enrich that for them. That would reflect what we do here at the Crick. And of course, we wanted to highlight those transferable skills of teamwork and sharing ideas, which when people are sitting at home on their own is a little bit more tricky. So it was good in some ways, not good in others. If I could have the next slide, please. Of course, what we could do is just do the same thing, but do it in person. And then all of those problems of not being able to do it in person become advantages. There are other disadvantages that go with it, I understand that, but that is exactly what we're going to do. Our colleague Ellie is now taking this activity and she's working it up, including more careers related links, and this is going to become one of our core offerings. This has been a real advantage for us to have the time and being forced almost to think of a new topic, a new way of doing things, and by going virtual. And finally, if I can have the last slide, Maria. As I say, what we're doing here is the topic itself, all of those different things are fine if you're going to do it in person or virtually, but those ones in the top left-hand corner are the ones where we've really won. If it wasn't for the fact of having the virus go through our schools and us having to do this virtually, we wouldn't have actually hit on those advantages in the top left-hand corner. We wouldn't be doing it in the way that we now are. So we really do view this as a really good way of going forwards. And indeed, for scaling up lots of different activities, as Christina's already said, is going virtual is really going to help us here at Crick. So I'll stop there and I'll hand back to Maria.
Thank you, Andy. So now my colleague Richard Harrison and I will speak about a borough-wide primary science challenge that we've converted in order to make it accessible during these extraordinary times.
Good morning, folks. My name's Richard. I work at Regent High School, which is one of Camden's 10 secondary schools, and we've worked with the Crick since before the Crick's building existed, if I remember correctly. We host the satellite discovery zone, which is the Crick's teaching zone inside Regent High School. And through that relationship, we started working on a primary science challenge. I must confess at this point, I've been looking at who's in the room. I'm probably the least scientifically qualified person here, so I do ask for forgiveness if my terminology is a little bit off today. My background is in the A of STEAM much more than the STEM of STEAM, but we're a school that really works with external partners in order to, as Andy said, extend and enrich learning. We are fortunate to have a huge range of organisations on our doorstep, and we think it's incumbent upon us to extend opportunities to work with people like Maria and Andy and colleagues from the Crick to really help our students to understand what lies ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Ocampo-Hafalla. I'm the lab manager for education, and I'm a science educator here at the Crick. And I've had the huge pleasure and privilege of working with Richard, as well as colleagues from Welcome, on the Science Challenge. So the Camden Primary Science Challenge is a challenge for children in Year 5 across Camden's primary schools. And we've been working in partnership on this event since 2013. In fact, Amanda Hardy from the RSB was one of our partners for one of our previous events before the pandemic. Now, the challenge allows pupils in Year 5 to investigate an aspect of science that's linked to the national curriculum. And then we provide Camden teachers with free training and equipment in order to support this investigation. We hold a CPD session in early May for the teachers. And in this picture, it shows you the teachers at Regent High School being the Year 5 students and being trained how to do the investigation.
So folks, in an ordinary year, schools then have the rest of half term 5 to undertake the challenge with their pupils. The pupils conduct in-class investigations and then select a format to present their findings. Going back to something that Andy was saying in terms of science communication, it's really important the way that students communicate as well as what they communicate. We hold the final on the day of the Great Science Share for schools in mid-June. As many of you will know, the Great Science Share is an international celebration of science for, with and by young people. So it made absolute sense for us to tie the two together. Ordinarily, children from the participating schools from across Camden are invited to present their findings in that venue that you see on the screen there, which is our 200-seat theatre. So they come in and present to a range of expert scientists, including Maria, our colleague Louise from Welcome, and our head of science here. And it means that students get to visit a secondary school as part of the experience. But then the pandemic happened, and we sat and I can remember having a conversation with Maria about whether this could continue, whether we could still run a science challenge. And very quickly, we said yes. We noted that the Crick team was working remotely. Schools were, to all intents and purposes, closed, apart from for those children who were most vulnerable or whose parents were key workers. And we wanted to make sure that we could enrich the learning that was happening largely at home at that time, and really tap into the fact that science was really seeing a boom of interest, with people developing vaccines and responses to COVID, as well as to other challenges of our time. So we thought about translating our face-to-face programme into something that we could deliver virtually, that students could do at home with minimal input from their teachers.
So in order to adapt the challenge, we actually opened it up to more year groups in order to be able to reach a greater cohort of children. So instead of being aimed at just Year 5, we opened it to Years 4, 5, and 6. Our CPD, instead of being in person, became online. We relied on Zoom to be able to communicate with the teachers and to launch the challenge. We didn't allow a particular topic, whereas in the past we might have said, oh, sound or pH or forces. We gave them full freedom to choose what aspect of science they wanted to discover and explore about. We also went away from the reliance on equipment. So the Crick used to use the challenge as an opportunity to provide equipment to primary schools, but with the children being at home rather than in school, this was no longer an issue. And again, we wanted to give children choice of activities. So it was quite a broad-based challenge, and the teachers became the judges rather than us as the scientists, and individual children for the first time could win prizes. And the response was remarkable. So during a time when there was so much uncertainty, the children brought out their creativity and showed us, really inspired us, and reminded us of why we do the work that we do. So we had 45 children's entries that the teachers had selected, and these were showcased online for the very first time as well. So with the final no longer being possible as an in-person celebration, we celebrated the children's achievements online.
You see on the screen now an example of the webpage, and in fact it is still on our website, such as the quality of the work that we wanted to continue to celebrate it. So Regent High School hosts it, and a range of the winning entries were displayed there, along with an explanation as to what the challenge was all about. And it just means that those children see themselves as scientists who are communicating with that wider audience. And in fact, after 2020, we wrote to the all school bulletin for Camden to make all teachers aware of this being available, and also to help secondary teachers, secondary science teachers in particular, understand the level of quality and ingenuity shown by the children that will one day arrive in their classrooms.
So the children's work, again, expands through a whole range of different topics. So some chose the pandemic, obviously, as their focus. Others chose the planets. Some spoke about electricity, and others talked about female role models in science. And they continued to be creative in how they presented their work. So some had PowerPoint presentations, some had posters, some recorded themselves describing the science investigation that they had undertaken at home. And the creativity and the science continued despite disruption in so many other areas of our lives.
So as we all know, this academic year, or last academic year as it is now, wasn't quite back to normal. We were largely back in school by the summer, but we knew that we couldn't run the Science Challenge in the same face-to-face way. As Christina and Berta were talking about earlier, risk assessments meant that we were all limiting those people from outside of our schools who could visit. So we had another conversation, and you see on the screen there our co-sponsors from Welcome, so Louise and Thomas, who have been on this journey with us for a number of years. And we came back together and decided that we needed to be able to do something that involved students participating in their class, ideally, or at home if they were self-isolating or if a bubble went down. And we noted that this year would be the United Kingdom's host time for COP26. So we wanted to tie the theme back to COP26 and to the thing that was most alerting students to science in their everyday lives, which is the climate crisis. And we posed them the provocation, the world isn't listening.
And again, we tried to enlarge the reach of the Science Challenge. So this year we included Year 3 pupils as well. So all of Key Stage 2 was now eligible to take part. We still remained online in terms of our communications with the teachers and the support we provided for them. Again, there was no equipment provided. So children had to do this investigation just with the equipment they had in their classrooms in their homes, but we provided a little bit more flexibility in this hybrid environment where some schools were open, but some children had to be at home. We wanted everyone to be able to take part. You'll notice that the engagement with children did not become digital. So although we engaged with the teachers online, we did not engage directly with the students. And part of that was a very careful decision and an acknowledgement of the fact that in Camden, we have a bit of a digital divide. We're aware that not all of our children had access to the devices. And in fact, Richard and his school and the whole borough of Camden had a fundraising drive in order to ensure that each child had a device that they needed. So the aim was to have not just one device per family, but one device per child if possible. And we were very mindful of this. And so that although we didn't engage with the children directly, we wanted to encourage the science in their classrooms, their homes. And again, this was reflected in the slight changes we made to our format. One new innovation, however, was that we had an online final. And this was Richard's suggestion, because a really important aspect of the challenge was the opportunity to celebrate and to share. And while the online website was a wonderful resource, and it will be a legacy of all of the children's work for years to come, and a useful resource, the children missed the excitement and the celebration of seeing each other's work and sharing this achievement with each other. And so we held our final online, and the children zoomed in with their classrooms in order to see this. And this provided us with a level of safeguarding as well. So instead of zooming directly into children's homes, where not everyone may have a device, the Zoom final was run through the schools so that the children were in a safe environment and the technology was approved by the school, and we were able to do this.
I must say that final, the excitement was absolutely palpable. Having 14 different classes all zooming in was just incredible, and I recommend that as an opportunity if you can't bring people together. As Maria said, we are still showcasing the work from this year on the school website as well. So again, whether you're looking to run an event like this or simply to see younger children's take on science and on the climate crisis, I do urge you to take a look, because the work is joyful as well as accurate and clear. And if we go to the next slide, we can see there some very specific examples from a range of different schools, each responding to this idea that the world isn't listening, some of which was primary research, some of it was secondary research, and really open to students and their teachers to understand to explore what mattered to them at this point in time.
And what going digital for a second year in a row allowed us to do was just to really look back at our aims and objectives. And although we appreciated the flexibility and the inclusivity of offering a very general challenge the first year around, we were much more focused in encouraging the children's working scientifically skills and the work-related skills this time around. And you'll see that some of the children put graphs in, some made measurements over a period of time. So there was much more evidence of the working scientifically with this format of the challenge.
I think it's important to note that we need to be kind to ourselves as practitioners. The version of the first year was built upon and developed by 2021. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that things will grow, and not to criticise what we did the first time round, but to say, right, this achieved so much, let's build on it this year. In terms of achievements overall across the 2 years, there was huge enthusiasm for the 2 adapted challenges. All of our regular schools, if you like, came back, and some additional schools joined as well. And it meant that the greater number of schools that sent winning entries were able to be showcased when the final was held. A greater number of schools sent winning entries than when we have the final in the Regent Theatre. The quality of the work, as you've seen through some of the examples, and the ingenuity shown by the children was simply outstanding, particularly those who were working more remotely away from school in that first year, but certainly this second year, where teachers were able to craft and focus the children in a different way. And there is that lasting legacy. Anybody in the world can have a look at our pupils' outcomes on those 2 pages on the Regent High School site. And what was really important at a time when the world was talking about science, and at times not always being positive about the situation that humankind was facing, we had children giving us that positivity and allowing themselves to explore the wonder of science and the topics that matter to them. So it really helped to celebrate science, which is really important to the borough of Camden and to London beyond, at a time when it might have been more difficult ordinarily.
And I'd just like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to our Camden students and to our Camden schools and to our Crick colleagues and so many members of our community. During the time that these challenges were held, we appreciate that some of you had extreme difficulties. We had illnesses, we had bereavements. There were so many challenges. And yet through it all, you encouraged our children and you encouraged science in our community. So thank you for that. In terms of what we can improve, these discussions are always ongoing, and we aspire to make this challenge even more inclusive and more value for our local school communities whom we seek to support. So any future science challenge needs to be catalyzed by schools, and that element of partnership is really important. We always aim to make this program responsive to the school's needs, and we pay very close attention to what they want and what their children would most benefit from. And this is something we'll continue moving forward, and this will probably impact the format of future science challenges. One change that we are planning to make already for the upcoming year is we would like to make the final a hybrid format, so that some children will be able to present in person at Regent High School, because we really believe that that opportunity to visit a secondary school and to present live in front of a huge audience of your peers in quite a daunting room is a really important life skill. But equally, we want to continue to be able to reach as many children in as many schools as possible, and maintaining a hybrid format in which we're able to allow others to zoom in while even while others are present is a really key part of that. And again, we'd like to link this more to the Great Science Share so that we continue to share science more broadly outside of Camden. And with that, we're going to conclude our presentation and say thank you. And we'd like to pass on to our colleague, Lauren.
Hi, so thank you to the Crick education team who have spoken so far today. I'll be talking about the digital transformation of the Crick's Meter Scientist program. So, hi everyone, my name is Lauren Treacher. I am the Public Engagement Coordinator at the Crick, and I work on the rest of the public engagement team of the education team. So I work on our exhibitions program, I work on our community outreach program, and I work on our events program. And the main program I run is called Meter Scientist. So can we go to the next slide, Maria? So what is Meter Scientist? What is this activity? Meter Scientist is one of Crick's flagship public engagement programs. It is usually a series of in-person events where members of the public, so anyone, can meet and have a conversation with a researcher or a scientist or someone who works at the Crick. It gives visitors the opportunity to ask questions about science and to hear what it's like to be a researcher, work in science or work at the Crick. And most importantly for me, Meter Scientist is meant to be fun, informal and accessible. Next slide, please, Maria. So, Meter Scientist aims and objectives. In summary, Meter Scientist for me is all about our audience's experiences and feelings about research. So, authentic and personal interactions, we want to grow and diversify the people who think the Crick research is interesting, important, and relevant. We want visitors' confidence to grow when engaging with science, and we want to highlight our researchers' personal narratives and humanize research. And in terms of audience, we're really keen to grow our BSA 3 group. So this is the group who are interested in science but don't necessarily seek it out. Next slide, please. So what changes did we make? March 2020, Meter Scientist went from an in-person event to a Q&A on Instagram stories, has been mentioned so far today. At this point, I want to give a big shout out to Mimi Martensen, who's now left the Crick and now works at Imperial. But moving to Instagram stories was her creation before I joined the Crick, and I've since taken over running it. So as has been mentioned before, the format is that it takes place over the whole week. So on a Monday, we post 2 Instagram stories, a few videos of researchers talking about their role, their research, what they get up to at the Crick, and we leave a Q&A sticker that's there for 24 hours so our followers can ask questions to the researchers. After 24 hours has passed, I review the questions and pick the best ones and send a selection of them to the researchers to answer. They then have a few days to film themselves answering those questions. And then on the Friday, we post their responses. And the audience for the Instagram Meter Scientist is exactly the same. We really want to grow our BSA 3 group, so people who aren't seeking out science. If we could go to the next slide, please. The next one after that would be great. Perfect. So what worked well and what did we learn? It seems obvious to say, but I think it's really important that you can and should hone and tweak both the external look of a program and the internal process. I completely agree with what Richard and everyone else has said so far today. Doing stuff on digital is completely different, and we are allowed to make it better over time. In terms of the external program, I think when using social media, it's really important to think about the platform that you're using. So on Instagram, more so than other platforms like Twitter, the emphasis is really on how content looks, and like you want it to look nice and it's consumed quickly. So I developed branding and templates for the stories. I'd say having some pre-formatted backgrounds are really useful. We've played around with the format. For example, we've made the most of the functionality within Instagram and we've used quizzes, and these have been really popular. Thinking about what works well on Instagram, microscopy images look amazing, and followers have engaged really well with these.
Sorry to interrupt, Lauren, but we've just got 1 more minute left.
Okay, sure. So I guess the main thing I'd say about the platform is that when doing in public engagement on social media is that less is more. Instagram content is meant to be short. You can't recreate a 10-minute conversation that you'd have in person, and that's okay. You can't measure success in the same way on social media as you would as in person. It's different for a reason. And the one thing I'd reflect on about honing the internal process is just make the offer for participants as simple as possible. Lots of people are quite scared of social media. And so it was really important to reassure people. And actually, I did all the posting on Instagram. We removed so that none of the scientists had to do any of that. So they pre-filmed everything. They'd send it to me. I'd write all the captions. I'd do all the posting. I'd do all the editing. And yeah, if we could just really quickly jump to the last slide, Maria. So what next? In-person events have returned. So now we're back to a balance of Instagram Meet a Scientist and in-person. And actually, as people have said today, that gives you great flexibility, that you can choose when you want to do it and you have more opportunity to think about what you want to do in advance. And if we could just quickly go to the last slide. I would recommend everyone to follow the Crick on Instagram and come and see Meet a Scientist in action, or come and visit us in person if you're in the King's Cross area of London. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for Maria and her team at the Francis Crick Institute. It really shows great examples of how you have trying to break down those boundaries and engage audiences throughout the pandemic, really. We're going to go to questions now. So if you have any questions, please do drop them into the chat. Or if you'd like to ask a question verbally to any of Maria or her colleagues, please raise your hand using the raise a hand function on Zoom, and we'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to speak. But please do remember that the session is being recorded. And also, I think a few of you had a few audio issues during the session today. So if you still do have those issues, please just log out of Zoom and log back in. And I would like to just also request all speakers, or if you're not speaking, please turn off your video just to help with the bandwidth. So yeah, I think if anyone's got any questions, please do put them into the chat. But I think I'm going to start with a question that has come in to, I guess, Christina and Berta. Something that you mentioned during your talk was about including a challenge for the students to do in their activity. Why was this so important to you to include a challenge for students?
Berta, do you want me to take this? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question. And obviously, as we explained, we weren't directly involved in the challenge taking place. We provided the equipment and the resources for it to happen, and we guided the teacher in facilitating it. But we do feel it was a really important part of our event, and that's because it allowed really valuable dialogue in that second video session with the children. So half of that was dedicated to them feeding back to us. They took it in turns to tell us what they've discovered in the challenge and their ideas for what they do next. And I think it was very apparent to myself and Berta just sort of how passionate they were about the challenge and how important it was for them to get feedback from a scientist as well. So Berta was able to comment on their findings and on the way that they'd worked scientifically. So yeah, it really did add value. And also we got great feedback from the teachers. We recommended they spend an hour on this challenge, and one class spent 2 hours and the other class spent 3 hours. So it just gave them, yeah, they had this real motivation because they knew they were going to be chatting to Berta again to spend lots of time on it. So definitely really important.
Cool, fantastic. I think we've got a question from Jonathan. So I'm going to unmute you, Jonathan, and you'll be able to speak. If you just bear with me a second. There you go, Jonathan, are you able to ask your question?
Okay, yeah, so question is for Maria and Richard, and I may have missed this because there were some sound issues, but you talked about when you switch things to being at home, that there were no equipment requirements. That was kind of an advantage. Did I misinterpret that?
No, you didn't. So normally in our traditional science challenge, we would provide a range of equipment for the teachers to take back to their classes in order to support the in-class investigation.
Right, but surely there will be more equipment needed for children at home, particularly children from lower income backgrounds who would almost certainly not have equipment that's suitable for
So what we did was we removed, for the first one, we removed the focus from very much the traditional experimentation protocol. So what the challenge we set them for the first virtual event was just to say, you can do several things. You can either do a challenge that your teacher has set, and the teacher bore in mind that the children would not have the same access to school equipment as they would have at home, or the children were allowed to create a presentation related to any science topic that was interesting for them. So for example, we had one child create a presentation on female role models and scientists. So she didn't need experiment per se. She didn't need to do an experiment per se in order to take part in the challenge. She didn't need particular kit.
I was just thinking of more like AV, like a computer.
Yes. Oh, so Richard, would you like to speak about that? So we did have a fundraising drive within Camden in order to support our children. So
Right.
we engage with the children directly through computers. We engaged with them through their schools. But Richard, perhaps you'd like to mention what we did to fundraise.
So virtually all of the schools in Camden are still local authority schools, and the local authority through Camden Learning, which is its education function, ran a fundraiser to provide laptops at least to each family who needed
Right.
one, and
Okay.
then ideally
that was
beyond.
what I was wondering. Okay,
Yeah,
that's great. Thank you.
They kind of happened at the same time, which was helpful for us.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maria and Richard. I think that really does help kind of bridge the gap for that digital divide. So what you've done there really has helped there. So yeah, we've got a few questions for Lauren actually regarding the Meet a Scientist and moving that online. So from Philippa actually, and she asks, are you considering expanding the Meet a Scientist project, for example, to other social media platforms? And why did you use Instagram to start off with anyway?
Well, it's a great question. I must admit, I'm not entirely sure why Instagram was chosen at the beginning, because it wasn't when I was at the Crick. I think for now we'll stick to Instagram stories. I didn't get a chance to expand, but the Instagram audience is a really friendly audience. We were really pleasantly surprised. It's not like Twitter. No one's there to have a fight. People just seem to be really nice and interested. So we have thought about trying out TikTok, but it feels like quite a big step when we've got quite a good format on Instagram. So I think for now, we will stick with that.
Sure. And how did you schedule the content, for instance? Did you use like a scheduling platform? And how many questions did you schedule for the different scientists, for example?
So we don't use a scheduling platform. It is me with them all lined up on my phone, sitting there for an hour posting them. I do think that's one area that we want to investigate to see if we can hone that slightly. The range of questions we get in terms of number is quite varied. It's usually over 20. I think the most we've ever had is around 40. But one of the benefits of giving people the full 24 hours to ask and then selecting the best is that usually you get lots of similar questions, but are phrased slightly differently. So it means you can kind of pick the nicest ones that are phrased best. And so in the first iteration of it on Instagram, we actually did it live. So not an Instagram live on stories, but it was like the scientist is here for 3 hours, ask them your questions. But it meant you had to answer the first question you got rather than being able to wait and kind of curate the questions that you get. But that was something that we were really pleased about, is that over the kind of 12 to 18 months we ran it, the questions we got increased in number and like the type of questions we got. And it became a lot more about the scientist as an individual and like their career path and their motivations, rather than just what is your greatest discovery you've had, which I think for me personally is really important to kind of humanize research and highlight the people's stories doing research.
It's amazing work. It definitely would have been a logistical challenge getting all of that content out there in time. And I really appreciate the fact you did that in real time, like not just waiting for receiving the questions and then posting answers like later on in the week, or for example, but actually doing that in real time, or getting to scientists to post videos as well. That's fantastic. I think we've got a question for Andy as well, actually. And something that you mentioned, Andy, during your talk is that one of the perhaps challenges, or kind of the challenges to the project you were working on, is that there wasn't much interaction or engagement with the teachers, for example, the students had over time. I think that's something you mentioned, that the digital engagement, one of the drawbacks for it was not much engagement with teachers. Have you considered how to increase that engagement, for example, with students over Zoom, for instance?
Yeah, so certainly in person, that's not too much of a problem. We go into their schools and we'll be working with those teachers in order to be able to deliver the content, because obviously it's great to have the teacher there in person as well. They know the students better than we do, and they can get the most out of their students. In terms of virtually, we did, as I said in the presentation, we had to go to the teachers, not just within the science department, but other departments too, in order to get them to suggest topics that they thought the students would be able to access. Getting them involved in the actual process when we were doing the Zooming, not so easy. As I said, the students were located in all sorts of different places. Adding in a teacher element to that as well makes it logistically very difficult. However, as we said, going forwards, we are going to be using this format of Zooming into lots of different schools, rather reflecting the way that Maria and Richard were saying, that you can reach more people and you can get more schools Zooming in at the same time. In that particular case, we can have the teacher there leading each session within the schools, and we can have that interaction with the teachers as well, not only in our setting this up and talking to them beforehand, getting them to suggest topics, but also to actually interact on the day. So I agree with you. I do hesitate, because what I prefer is that we are directly engaging the students, not the teachers. Having been a teacher myself, I know what it's like. Some teachers can sort of lead the way for the students a little bit too much, and I'd much prefer it just to be set up for the students to be able to express their thoughts in their own way.
Fantastic, Andy. I think a follow-up question to that, and maybe to some of your colleagues as well. How easy is it to get into schools, for example? There's all sorts of like safeguarding and other kind of concerns. How easy is it to like get into schools? I'm sure a lot of the attendees here may want to work with students of different ages, for example.
Yeah, there's lots of things to consider, but once you've gone through the process once, it's very much more straightforward. And I think Richard can probably talk about it from the other side of point of view as well, of getting an external organisation to come into their school. For us, yes, there's lots of safeguarding to bear in mind. We have on our team, we're an education team, so we know the setup. We know about the DBS checks. We know about the guidelines that are necessary when you get into a school, not working alone with a student, for example, and all sorts of other things. We do have the issue that if we do take our members of staff into a school, they're not necessarily familiar with schools and the way in which DBS checks are done. And also we have a very international staff here. And so even if they do in their own home country, they may not know what the rules are like in this country. So yes, we do have a set of processes, very careful processes set up. We have our own policy. It is necessary for our staff to read that policy and understand it and agree to it before going in. But once, as I say, it's set up once, it's great. Everybody knows which page they're on, and it's very, very good. Richard, would you like to add to that?
I'd agree with everything Andy said. I would also talk about the importance of long-lasting partnerships. That's the beauty of what Regent High School has with the Crick. For instance, our Year 13s are going into work with Andy on Friday, completely unrelated to the Primary Science Challenge, but there are a range of ways that our students and staff interact, and because we know what each other is looking for and each side is open to conversation, it makes it a really enriching partnership, but one that we can rely on. I think the worst thing for schools is to plan something that then doesn't happen because an organisation may not see the importance of it taking place as much as the school does. So I think those constant conversations with your closest partners and that mutual understanding really translate into very effective teaching and learning opportunities for the students.
Brilliant. And I think on that note, I've just seen the time, it is 12 o'clock. So I'd like to thank Maria and her team this morning for their time and expertise. And it's been wonderful to hear about really the digital transformation that you've had at the Francis Crick Institute with all of your projects. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Claire Davey, our education manager, who oversees the entire education program at the Crick and who's our line manager. I'd also like to thank Rosie Waldron, who's the head of public engagement, who creates such a wonderful culture for us to work in, and Jane Hughes, our director for public engagement and communications, as well as all of our Camden schools, teachers, and partners. Thank you very much for this opportunity.